I've never told this story to anyone who actually knows me, and I honestly don't think I ever will. Posting it here feels different. Maybe it's because nobody knows who I am, or maybe because strangers are sometimes less judgmental than people you've known your whole life. Either way, this is the truth about one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made. A lot of people imagine criminals as people who always plan to cross the line. That wasn't me. At least, that's what I believed for years. I had a steady job, paid my bills on time, and lived a life that looked completely ordinary. If you had met me back then, you probably would have described me as quiet, reliable, maybe even boring. Everything changed because of a few numbers. They weren't written on anything important, just a small note someone had carelessly left behind. At first, I barely noticed it. Later, I realized those numbers were an access code that opened the door to something valuable. I should have forgotten about it immediately. Instead, I kept thinking about how easily someone had trusted that nobody would misuse it. That thought stayed with me for days. Then days became weeks. Curiosity slowly turned into temptation, and temptation became something much harder to ignore. Looking back now, I don't think the crime started the day I acted. It started the moment I convinced myself that simply knowing the code didn't make me a bad person. Once the idea settled into my head, it refused to leave. I tried distracting myself with work, long walks, even convincing myself the code was probably useless. But every time I passed the building where I'd seen that little note, my mind wandered back to it. I started paying attention to things I had ignored before: who came and went, when the lobby was busy, when it was completely empty. I wasn't looking for trouble, at least that's what I kept telling myself. I was just observing. That was another lie. The truth is, I had already started preparing without admitting it to myself. I memorized the code so I wouldn't need the note. I made excuses to be nearby at different times of the day, pretending I was waiting for someone or killing time before work. Nobody paid any attention to me, which somehow made everything feel even more dangerous. Blending into the background gave me confidence I hadn't earned. Every small step made the next one seem less serious. By the end of that week, I wasn't wondering whether I would try the code anymore. I was only wondering when. By the time I picked a day, I had convinced myself I was prepared for everything. I chose a weekday afternoon because I had noticed the building was quieter after lunch but before people started leaving work. I dressed like I always did: plain jeans, a dark jacket, and comfortable shoes. Nothing that would make anyone remember me. I even left my phone at home for a few hours, thinking it would somehow make me less traceable. Looking back, that was more about calming my own nerves than actual planning. As I walked toward the entrance, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure people could hear it. I kept expecting someone to stop me and ask what I was doing there. Nobody did. The receptionist was busy on a phone call, barely looking up as I passed. That ordinary moment felt surreal. When I finally stood in front of the keypad, I stared at the numbers for several seconds. My hands were steady, but inside I was fighting the strongest urge to turn around and walk away before crossing a line I could never uncross. I took one slow breath and entered the code exactly as I remembered it. For a split second, nothing happened, and I actually felt relieved. I thought maybe I'd memorized it wrong. Then a soft beep echoed through the hallway, followed by the unmistakable click of the electronic lock releasing. It worked. The door opened just enough for me to pull it the rest of the way. I stood there frozen, staring into the room. It was almost disappointingly ordinary: shelves, filing cabinets, locked drawers, and stacks of labeled boxes. Nothing looked dramatic, yet I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped inside and quietly closed the door behind me. Every tiny sound suddenly seemed amplified. The air conditioner hummed overhead, and somewhere down the corridor I heard footsteps. My pulse shot up. I stayed perfectly still until the footsteps faded away. That's when I realized the code had only solved the first problem. Getting in had been easy. Figuring out what I had actually come for and how to leave without attracting attention was another challenge entirely. I had imagined that once I got inside, everything would be obvious. It wasn't. The room was neatly organized, but there were dozens of cabinets and storage boxes, each marked with labels that meant nothing to me. Suddenly my confidence disappeared. I wasn't a professional thief, I was just a nervous guy standing somewhere he had no right to be, hoping luck would carry him the rest of the way. I forced myself to stay calm and started looking around without making a mess. I opened a few drawers, carefully putting everything back exactly as I'd found it. Every passing second felt heavier than the last. I kept checking my watch, convinced that someone would walk through the door at any moment. Then I heard voices outside. They weren't loud, but they were getting closer. I instinctively stepped behind a tall shelving unit and held my breath. The conversation stopped just beyond the door. Someone tried the handle, paused for a second, then walked away. That single moment terrified me more than anything else. For the first time, I understood that curiosity had turned into a situation I couldn't simply laugh off or pretend had never happened. I waited another full minute before moving again. My legs felt stiff, and I could still hear my heartbeat in the silence. Whoever had been outside was gone, but the close call had changed something. The excitement I'd been chasing was gone, replaced by a constant voice in my head telling me to leave before my luck ran out. Instead, I stayed. On one of the shelves I noticed a small lockbox that matched a label I'd seen on a clipboard near the entrance. I opened it and found exactly what I'd suspected was stored there, items that clearly didn't belong to me and were obviously valuable. Seeing them made everything real. Up until then, I could pretend I was only satisfying my curiosity. The moment I reached toward that box, there was no room left for excuses. My hand actually stopped halfway. I remember thinking, you can still walk away. Nobody knows you're here. But another thought answered just as quickly, you've already come this far. That was the moment I made the decision I would regret for years. There wasn't any dramatic speech or burst of courage, just one selfish choice that changed the rest of the afternoon, and, in many ways, the rest of my life. The second I picked up the contents of the lockbox, the rush I had imagined never came. Instead, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching someone else make the worst decision of his life. I slipped the items into the inside pocket of my jacket, closed the box, and tried to leave everything exactly as I'd found it. I even wiped the surface with my sleeve without really knowing why. I think I was trying to erase my own presence more than any actual evidence. As I reached for the door, I heard footsteps again. This time they didn't pass by. The handle moved. I froze, staring at it as if that alone could stop the door from opening. Someone outside muttered something about the lock, tapped a few buttons on the keypad, then paused. My mind raced through a dozen impossible explanations I could give if they walked in. None of them sounded believable. After what felt like forever, a phone rang in the hallway. The person sighed, answered the call, and walked away while talking. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath the entire time. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the handle to leave. Getting out of the room should have been the easy part, but it felt even harder than getting in. Every person I passed suddenly looked suspicious, even though they barely acknowledged me. I kept my pace steady, resisting the urge to rush toward the exit. I'd always heard that panic attracts attention, so I focused on looking like someone who belonged there. When I finally stepped outside, I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt exposed. Every passing car made me glance over my shoulder. Every time my phone buzzed later that afternoon, my stomach tightened. I was convinced it would be someone asking where I had been or telling me they already knew what I'd done. Of course, nothing happened. That silence was almost worse. By the next morning, I had started checking local news and online community pages, expecting to read about the missing property or a security breach. I found nothing. It was as if the entire incident had disappeared without leaving a trace. Rather than making me feel safe, that uncertainty kept me trapped inside my own thoughts. I couldn't tell whether I'd escaped unnoticed or whether someone was quietly putting the pieces together, one detail at a time. 3 days passed without a single phone call, email, or unexpected knock at my door. On the surface, life returned to normal. I went to work, made small talk with coworkers, and followed the same routine I'd always had. The strange part was that I no longer felt like the same person. Every ordinary conversation carried a hidden layer of anxiety because I was constantly wondering whether someone knew more than they were letting on. Then the rumors started. People began talking about an internal investigation after something had been discovered missing. Nobody mentioned suspects, but they did mention security logs, access records, and interviews. Hearing those words made my blood run cold. I replayed every decision I'd made, trying to remember whether I'd overlooked something obvious. Had anyone seen me enter? Had a camera caught my face? Had I accidentally left behind some tiny clue? From that moment on, I stopped sleeping properly. Every unexpected notification made my pulse jump, and every unknown number felt like the beginning of the end. I had escaped the building, but mentally, I was still trapped inside it, waiting for the door to open and someone to call my name. About a week later, my manager casually mentioned that investigators had been speaking with employees and anyone who had been in the building around the time the missing property was discovered. He wasn't accusing me of anything. In fact, he seemed more annoyed by the inconvenience than concerned about the theft itself. Still, hearing those words made my chest tighten. A day later, I was asked to answer a few routine questions. They were simple enough. Why had I been in the area? What time had I arrived? Had I noticed anything unusual? I answered as calmly as I could, sticking as closely to the truth as possible without admitting why I had really been there. Every sentence felt like walking across thin ice, terrified that one careless word would break everything. To my surprise, the conversation ended without confrontation. They thanked me for my time and moved on to the next person. I walked out feeling relieved for exactly 5 minutes. Then the guilt came rushing back. I realized that avoiding immediate consequences wasn't the same as escaping them. The investigation had ended for everyone else, but inside my own head it had only just begun. Months went by, and eventually the investigation faded into the background. People stopped talking about it. New projects, new office gossip, and everyday life pushed the incident out of everyone's conversations. To everyone else, it was an old story. To me, it never really ended. The things I had taken stayed hidden where I had first put them. I couldn't bring myself to use them or even look at them for long. Every time I opened the drawer where they were stored, I felt the same knot in my stomach. They no longer looked valuable. They looked like physical proof of the person I had chosen to become that afternoon. I thought about getting rid of them more than once. I imagined throwing everything away, returning it anonymously, or leaving it somewhere it could be found. But every option carried its own risk, and fear kept me from acting. Ironically, the same fear that should have stopped me from committing the crime was now stopping me from trying to make things right. That's when I realized the biggest punishment wasn't prison or being caught. It was having to live every single day knowing I had betrayed my own principles. The turning point came almost a year later, and it happened in the most ordinary way imaginable. I was cleaning my apartment before moving to a new place when I found the drawer again. For months, I'd avoided opening it unless I absolutely had to. This time, there was no avoiding it. I picked up the stolen items and just stared at them. It struck me how little they actually mattered. I had risked my future, my reputation, and my peace of mind for something that had brought me absolutely nothing. They hadn't made me richer in any meaningful way. They hadn't solved any problems. If anything, they had created new ones that followed me every day. That afternoon, I made a decision I should have made from the beginning. Without contacting anyone directly or trying to explain myself, I found a way to return what I'd taken anonymously. I won't describe how, because the method isn't important. What matters is that I finally accepted responsibility in the only way I felt I safely could. Walking home afterward, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. The weight wasn't completely gone, but for the first time in a long while, it felt just a little lighter. Returning what I'd taken didn't erase what I'd done. I learned that almost immediately. I still caught myself replaying that afternoon whenever I walked past a keypad or saw someone carelessly punch in an access code. My mind always drifted back to the same question: what if I'd simply kept walking that day? It's amazing how one small decision can divide your life into a before and an after. I never found out whether anyone suspected me. Maybe the anonymous return answered enough questions for the people involved, or maybe they had already written the whole incident off as an unsolved mistake. Either way, I stopped waiting for a knock at my door. The fear slowly faded, but it left something else behind, a constant awareness of how easily ordinary people can justify crossing a line. I used to believe integrity was something you either had or didn't have. Now I think it's something you protect through countless small choices every single day. The moment you start making excuses for yourself, those choices become a lot easier to ignore, and that's far more dangerous than I ever understood. I still think about that code sometimes. Not because I miss the thrill or wish I could relive what happened, but because it reminds me how ordinary temptation can look. There wasn't a dramatic mastermind behind it, no elaborate scheme, and no desperate situation forcing my hand. There was only an opportunity, a series of rationalizations, and my willingness to believe them. People often ask how someone crosses a moral line without realizing it. From my experience, it rarely happens all at once. It happens one excuse at a time. First, you tell yourself you're only curious. Then you convince yourself you're just looking. After that, you decide that entering isn't really stealing. Before long, you've built an entire story that makes your actions sound reasonable, even to yourself. That realization changed the way I judge both myself and other people. Most of us like to believe we'd always make the right choice under pressure. I used to believe that too. Now I know character isn't revealed by impossible decisions. It's revealed by the ordinary ones, especially when nobody else is watching. If you've made it this far, you're probably expecting me to say that everything worked out in the end. It didn't, not completely. I was never arrested, never stood in a courtroom, and never had to explain my actions to the people I hurt. In that sense, I got away with it. But escaping legal consequences isn't the same as escaping yourself. For a long time, I carried the memory like an invisible weight. It changed the way I looked at trust, responsibility, and even my own reflection. I realized that the hardest part wasn't living with the fear of being caught. It was accepting that I had willingly become the kind of person I always believed I wasn't. If there's one thing I'd want anyone reading this to take away, it's this: the most dangerous decisions rarely feel dangerous in the moment. They arrive disguised as harmless opportunities, tiny shortcuts, or innocent curiosity. That's exactly how they trap you. If you ever find yourself holding the key to something that isn't yours, whether it's a code, a password, or an unexpected opportunity, walk away. You might think you're only risking a single moment, but what you're really gambling with is the person you'll have to live with afterward.